Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to everyone joining us from around the world on this global day of action on climate change. I'm Bonnie Abaunza, and I'm running the social impact campaign for the film River of Gold. I'm honored to be moderating this online conversation with these distinguished panelists from 3 organizations that focus on human rights, indigenous rights, and environmental justice. Today, we stand in solidarity with the millions of people around the world who are demanding action from our leaders on the climate crisis that affects us all. We are grateful to Greta Thunberg and all of the young activists in over 150 countries for their courage, passion, and commitment to saving our planet. In the past 24-hour period, Amazon Aid Foundation made its documentary River of Gold available for the global public to watch. With the recent fires devastating the Amazon, our conversation today is timely, and the panelists will discuss the numerous issues raised in the film and offer calls to action. I would now like to introduce them. Sarah DuPont, filmmaker, founder, and president of Amazon Aid Foundation. Juliane Kippenberg, Associate Director, Children's Rights Division, Human Rights Watch. And Daniel Lavelle, US Director of Survival International. Thank you all for joining us. Before we begin our conversation, I would like to ask all 3 panelists to make brief remarks about their organizations, and then we'll dive right into the discussion. Sarah, let's begin with you.
Well, first of all, thank you, Bonnie, for the generous intro, and thanks to all participating in this webinar. I'm honored to be part of such an esteemed group. Our mission, Amazon Aid's mission, is to inspire change to protect the Amazon. We are fortunate to work with some of the world's best tropical scientists to create scientifically impeccable multimedia that educates global audiences about the importance of the Amazon, the implications of its destructions, and to promote solutions for protecting it. Our award-winning projects have been seen on 5 continents and have been an inspiration for global policy change. One of our strengths is in building coalitions and partnerships with other organizations, influencers, and global citizens in aligned missions to protect the Amazon and mitigate the effects, in this case, of unregulated and illegal gold mining. We are big believers that we are better together. Our greatest hope is to educate and inspire the world to become a voice to save the Amazon. If you don't know what you're about to lose, then how can you engage in solutions to protect it? The Amazon is at the tipping point, but we have a door to walk through now to save it. All hands on deck. I remain hopeful.
Juliane?
Yes, thank you. Good morning and good afternoon. At Human Rights Watch, we have documented very serious human rights violations that have taken place in the context of gold mining in different countries around the world. For example, hazardous child labor, forced labor and trafficking, as well as toxic pollution from gold mining, making people, local residents near mines, sick. In my own work, I have interviewed hundreds of children working in small-scale gold mines in the Philippines, for example, and in different parts of Africa. And I've seen with my own eyes children who've been carrying extremely heavy weights on their backs or heads, working in very unstable pits, processing gold from small-scale mines with toxic mercury, unaware of the effects. And I've also spoken to parents whose children have actually died in mining accidents. We wanted to know what jewelry companies are doing about these issues when they source gold. And so we assessed the response of 13 well-known jewelry brands and looked a little bit further. And we found that many of these companies have still a long way to go. Oftentimes, jewelry companies do not know where the gold originates from. And as a result, they don't know what the human rights conditions are in and around the mines that they're sourcing from. Many companies are also not transparent enough to their customers, to the public, about their supply chain and the steps they're taking to source responsibly. We have therefore launched a campaign, the Behind the Bling campaign, to illustrate and highlight the suffering that's really taking place oftentimes behind this glitzy, beautiful jewelry, for example, in gold mining. And we're calling upon jewelry companies to ensure that their gold supply chains are traceable, transparent, and checked for human rights risks.
Thank you very much. And I'll turn to Daniel.
Hi, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. Honored to be here. Thanks to all the organizers and all the work they put in to make this happen. At Survival International, we work in partnership with tribal and indigenous peoples to protect their lives and their lands. And we've done that for 50 years now. We fought with tribal peoples for their survival in the face of racism, land theft, and genocidal violence, including in the Amazon. And we work to stop gold miners, as well as loggers, oil companies, cattle ranchers from destroying these lands, the livelihoods and lives of indigenous peoples across the globe. And how do we do this? Well, we lobby governments to recognize indigenous land rights. We document and expose atrocities committed against indigenous peoples. We take direct action to stop these actions, to stop these atrocities. And really importantly, we think we also provide a platform for indigenous voices to be broadcast and heard around the world. And we've seen over the last 50 years of our work that when there's a big enough public outcry against abuses of indigenous peoples, that these abuses can be stopped. And so this is really critical in the fight against illegal gold mining and other types of extractives in indigenous areas, as this mining often takes place through the invasion of indigenous territories. And really their fight is our fight.
Thank you very much. Okay, let's just jump right into the conversation now. So Sarah, beginning with you, what are Amazon Aid's goals with the River of Gold project, and how would you like people engaged? And then as a second part of that question is, why should people care about the Amazon? It has referred to as the lungs of the planet, and with the recent fires, people are expressing more interest, but how does the destruction of the Amazon affect the people locally, but also globally?
So that's a loaded double question. But Amazon Aid, what we're doing with the River of Gold is to use the power of film to create change. And as you may know, everyone on this webinar, that Abaunza, who was leading the campaign, actually did the Blood Diamond campaign and led the campaigns for many, many films like Food Inc. and Hotel Rwanda. And so the goal is to take a film and educate the general public and push for change for people to not only be aware where their gold comes from, but to promote a responsible supply chain for gold. So the River of Gold project is not only the film, but it's a social impact campaign. It's 200 pages of free middle and high school curriculum. We're putting together a resource guide from the ground up, from the miners on the ground all the way to the consumers, of how they can engage in a clean supply chain for gold. It's a very, very complex, difficult situation, and we're trying to put a lot of information together so people can educate themselves about what's going on. We have many, many educational initiatives that, for all the way from the youth to an elderly person like myself, not really getting there, but that can engage to not only learn about the Amazon, but engage in solutions for protecting it. And a lot of it has to do with how you are as a consumer. So as far as the fires go, most of them are man-made. And what is happening is, as the world heats up, the Amazon is heating up, it's getting hotter. And when you cut down trees, the areas dry out. So you've got a hotter, drier area. And the forest, the Amazon in the past really never had a problem with fires. And these trees create their own moisture. Again, if you cut them down, it dries out. So they've been practicing slash and burn, a technique in the Amazon where they they burn the trees to clear lands for agriculture, logging, soy, gold mining, all the different activities where they're getting natural resources or agriculture out of the land. And these fires are getting out of control. As a system, the Amazon is probably the most important land ecosystem for mitigating the climate crisis. Every day it puts 20 billion tons of moisture into the atmosphere, seeding the clouds globally with rain. And you need 80% of the trees standing to continue that incredibly critical ecosystem, hydrological cycle. And 80% of the trees we need, and we're at around 81. So the Amazon's at the tipping point. If we lose it, all that moisture could be gone, and it will affect everyone's backyard. Also, having the Amazon on fire, that's releasing carbon into the atmosphere, exacerbating the climate crisis. So it's an incredibly important system, and everyone needs to be aware about how it's affecting you and what they can do to help mitigate the issue, the burnings and the fires and the destruction.
Thank you. Now, the film obviously focuses on the Madre de Dios region in the Peruvian Amazon, and you show us illegal gold mining, the traffickers involved, what's happening with the release of the mercury, human rights abuses associated with illegal gold mining. So I'd like to just turn to Daniel right now, and then I'll turn to Juliane. So Daniel, talk about the impact of this illegal gold mining on the indigenous people in the Amazon, and what Survival International, how you're tackling that issue, and what can people do to support your efforts?
Well, there's really a large number of impacts that come with gold mining for indigenous peoples. First, the most obvious ones are the health impacts that stem primarily from the mercury used in the gold mine extraction process. In areas of the Amazon where survival has worked, especially with the Yanomami in Brazil and Venezuela, where there's been an extreme recent increase in illegal gold mining in their territory. So we have estimates of up to 10,000 legal gold miners there in this territory. And we're finding very high levels of mercury that leak into local rivers, that contaminate the water supply and fish. And just for one example, in the community of Abaunza, there's found 92% of all hair and fish samples that were collected in these communities near the mines had extremely high levels of mercury.
You say 92%?
Yeah, 92% of samples in this one community. So farther away from mining, there's a direct correlation. You can see farther away from mining activity, you get much less mercury levels. So they're definitely related to the mines. And you can see it's very widespread when they are close. And relatedly, many indigenous peoples in the Amazon, they manage and depend on the natural resources around them to sustain their livelihoods and their culture. And we've seen when their land base is protected that these peoples can thrive, but mercury pollution, other damage to the waterways, deforestation, road building and other things that come in that cause environmental destruction really impacts their ability to feed their families, just on a very basic human level. We see that. And we are also seeing, in many cases, we're talking about remote areas where miners are coming in, where local populations, and especially where there are still uncontacted groups of indigenous peoples. In these areas, there's very little resistance to common diseases that miners often bring with them unwittingly, like measles. And we've had really a lot of tragic examples of this. Back in the 1980s, 20% of the Yanomami population in Brazil died from diseases brought in by gold miners. This was a previous gold rush in the 1980s and the early 90s. So these can really have devastating effects on communities to be able to continue functioning as coherent societies. And lastly, I'll just point out that miners, when they come in, they're also bringing conflict or bringing violence. They often see indigenous peoples as in the way. So many indigenous communities have been threatened, shot by miners in an area where there's little or to no control, as we see in the film. So there's really a whole set of really damaging impacts for indigenous people when gold mining enters their territories.
And does Survival engage in conversations with the governments in Amazonia to discuss, the plight of the indigenous peoples and the impact that the illegal gold mining is having?
Yes, most definitely. So we really believe and have seen throughout the years working there that the most effective way to have some long-term impact and short-term impact is possible sometimes too, is large public pressure brought to bear upon the bad actors, and along with that to the government to pressure them to act. If it's off the radar screen, if indigenous voices are not heard, are not part of the conversation, it's very easy for authorities to turn a blind eye. And of course, many, both companies and, government officials may have a monetary interest as well as in letting illegal activity continue. So we really work to be a spotlight for any atrocities that are happening, right, to highlight the damage that's being caused, and also to give a microphone directly to the indigenous peoples that are affected, to have their voice heard. And we try to amplify that both in countries like Brazil, but especially in the US and Europe, where if we get a big enough and sustained outcry over this, we really have seen how this can have really positive impacts on the ground. And sometimes it does take a long time, but we have had successes with this. And one good case that we have had success with is the Yanomami, which was over a decade-long campaign to try to get their land and territorial rights recognized by the Brazilian government in 1995. That was successful. And of course, as we know now, that it's also requires constant vigilance and constant campaigning. So it's really it's a lifetime, really, of work. But that's the work we're engaged with because we can see how it's been effective.
Thank you. Now, Juliane, let's turn to the jewelers. And you brought up your Behind the Bling campaign. And let me just backtrack a little. So Sarah brought up the Blood Diamond campaign, which I ran with my colleagues at Amnesty International in partnership with Global Witness and tied to the film Blood Diamond. That movie and that campaign really brought that issue to the public's consciousness. And the term blood diamond became part of the populist vernacular. We have blood minerals, blood gold, blood chocolate. Those of us in this arena understand the Kimberley process and that the Kimberley process is flawed in many ways. But I'd like you to discuss, is there something similar to the Kimberley process that the Responsible Jewelry Council is pushing when it comes to responsibly sourcing gold? Tell me about that whole ecosystem and really what the jewelers are doing to combat this problem of illegal gold mining. And again, for the public that knows about the Kimberley process, is there something similar? And what can they do as consumers to make sure that the gold they are buying is not tainted in any way with human rights violations, labor rights violations?
Yeah, thank you. First of all, to answer your question about certification and is there something like the Kimberley process? So yes and no. The Kimberley process has been set up by governments and basically works to control the trade and the exports. There isn't really quite a system like that. There are a number of certification systems and voluntary initiatives to basically promote responsible sourcing in the gold supply chain. I mean, over the last decade, I would say that there have been actually so many different initiatives on gold that it's really hard to keep track of it and it becomes almost confusing. What from our perspective is really missing is ultimately a very strong and rigorous mandatory requirement that obviously doesn't exist, neither on the international level nor on national laws. You generally have usually a requirement for what's called human rights due diligence, so really good human rights safeguards that companies are obliged to have in place. There were a few exceptions to this. For example, France recently passed such a law, but generally speaking, there isn't really a law. However, as you just mentioned, there are, or asked about, there are initiatives that are a little bit more like voluntary certification, and that is notably the Responsible Jewelry Council. The Responsible Jewelry Council is the largest industry group that sort of represents the industry interests and jewelers, brings together jewelers, but also other companies in the supply chain for jewelry, not just gold, but gold, diamonds, and a few others now as well. And it has over 1,100 member companies. So it's quite significant and quite strongly sort of visible as an organization that sees itself as promoting responsible sourcing. Is certification a good thing? It can be a good thing, but it can also be problematic. When we looked at the role of the jewelry industry, we took also a closer look, not just at individual companies, but also at the certification model of the Responsible Jewelry Council. And what it is they have what's called a code of practices. It's basically a code of conduct that all members have to follow. And until recently, until April this year, this code of conduct was very vague and had a lot of gaps. And we criticized this last year with our big, at the beginning of our big campaign, highlighting how intransparent it is and how it was actually falling short of even the international norm. So the basic standard on responsible sourcing that has been set by the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, the OECD. Possibly in part due to our pressure, but also the pressure of many other actors. And I will say that our campaign was not just conducted by us, but we launched an appeal by over 20 NGOs and also trade unions to the RJC, to the Responsible Jewelry Council. Then a new standard was launched earlier this year in April. And it is positive in the sense that it is now at least in line with the norms on international sourcing. Basically, the idea of human rights safeguards that companies need to assess their supply chains for human rights risks. It's not enough to, for example, just go down one supplier and rely on their assurances. And also the principle that companies need to get their sourcing practices checked by third parties, so by audits. It's not enough to just say, oh, we're doing this and we're doing great. And the requirement to go public. So there's a number of really good and important elements in this new standard. We really will have to see how it works out. It's very new. It's hardly being applied. I mean, just being, rolled out now. But we also still see a number of real weaknesses with it. And one is actually to do with indigenous people's rights. The standard does not stick to the clear requirement for free, prior, and informed consent from indigenous peoples for example, exploration of minerals. It waters down that language. It also puts the diamond industry, interestingly, on a slower track. So in its implementation plan, it basically gives the diamond industry a couple of more years to implement this, which we find pretty surprising. And it really makes the RJC look as being very soft on the diamond industry. And then lastly, the certification process in itself, we have found it to be very opaque, and it continues to be that. So even when potentially a really solid process is actually taking place for certification, it's almost impossible for a consumer, for a trade union, for a worker, for the interested public to know what actually makes a company get a certificate, what is actually behind this. So we're still fairly critical of it, although we also think it has been strengthened and there's sort of, potentially room for hope here. What do companies need to do? I mean, in short, what companies really need to do is they have to know where their gold and the other materials are coming from. If they do not know the mines of origin, how can they know the human rights conditions? So obviously companies need to establish full traceability. This may be quite hard for jewelers who are in other countries far away from, say, the Amazon, where the gold mining may be taking place. But then they have to use and require from their suppliers that they give them the evidence that where the material is exactly coming from. So they need to have in place the controls and checks to know where the gold is from, and they need to require this from their suppliers, which isn't always happening right now. Oftentimes they rely on very vague and also oral assurances from their suppliers, and that's not good enough. So first of all, traceability is needed. Secondly, companies need to obviously assess human rights risks. It's not enough to know, oh, my gold is coming from this and such mine in Peru. They obviously need to know what are the conditions in that mine and around that mine. What is the impact of the gold mining, for example, on indigenous people's rights? And so a clear human rights assessment needs to be undertaken. And when human rights violations are found, the company has the obligation to address these. So we've seen this with child labor, that, for example, sometimes companies have actually tried in collaboration with their suppliers to address certain problems. We also have seen this for, say, certain kinds of labor rights issues. And that needs to happen. And if that doesn't happen within a clear time frame, then a company will actually have to take the decision not to source from this location, because it would just be contributing to violations. We're not saying that companies should, for example, in general, always immediately stop sourcing, say, from whole areas or countries, just because there are human rights abuses that have taken place there. So, for example, we're not saying companies should never source from the Amazon. But companies should only do that if they have the clarity and have the evidence that rights are respected, and of course the environment. And then thirdly, and this is very important, is the issue of public reporting. Companies oftentimes do not really inform the consumer, the public, and so on about what they're actually doing. But by providing that information, providing the information on the steps they're taking, and also providing information on who their suppliers are, they give the public in general, the workers, the miners, the local residents, people who are affected, the opportunity to actually scrutinize them and ultimately take action to improve the situation. So this is very, very important. And it's not just for PR purposes for the company. In any case, it shouldn't be. It should really be an exercise of accountability. So that's what should be happening. Unfortunately, we don't see companies oftentimes doing that. We ranked the 13 companies that we scrutinized, and we saw differences. So we saw, for example, that Tiffany, the US-based jeweler, is doing fairly well in the sense that they have a very short supply chain to one mine and know where the gold is coming from and also conduct checks there. We have also seen how, for example, Chopard, the Swiss jeweler, and a couple of other jewelers as well, are sourcing from the mines in Latin America that are Fair Mine certified, which actually is at least a step in the right direction from our perspective. Not that we can guarantee it, but we see that the Fair Mine standard is fairly rigorous and allows for greater scrutiny than probably what most companies sort of do. And then lastly, you asked this question about, so what should the ordinary person do? They want to buy a wedding ring, they want to buy a necklace for their mother, what are they going to do? From our perspective, what people should do is when they want to buy a piece of jewelry, they should ask the jeweler tough questions. They should ask 3 questions. They should ask, where is this gold from? What have you done to find out about the human rights conditions in and around the mine? And who are your suppliers? It is really important that consumers ask these questions because it puts pressure on the companies, potentially more than if an NGO says something. And the more companies feel there's a real sensitivity among consumers, and there is currently a rising sensitivity, particularly among millennials, the more they will be likely to actually take that seriously and improve their actions.
And that's what we did see with the Blood Diamond campaign. People were going into their jewelers and asking specific questions. And I remember during that period of time when jewelry stores actually would have these signs on their windows saying, we certify our diamonds conflict-free, and they were actually handing out brochures and information because people were coming in to ask. So that was very important engagement from the consumer. Someone just sent me an email question. They went and saw the Behind the Bling campaign on your website, and they're asking, even though you work in coalition, how have these jewelers responded when you, Human Rights Watch, reaches out to them to talk about their responsibly sourcing their gold? Are they open to speaking to you directly, or is there resistance?
Yes. They were definitely willing to speak to us, at least some of the jewelers. What we did is before we even went public and started the campaign, we spent about a year reaching out to jewelers, with letters initially, and then seeking meetings with them. And of the 13 jewelers that we contacted, in the end, 11 actually got back to us. And I should say they were from various world regions. They were from the US, from Europe, and from India. And only 2 did not respond at all: Rolex in Switzerland and Kalyan in India. So in that process, we were able to really establish a rapport, and sometimes that was easier, sometimes that was harder. But ultimately, several companies came back to us and said that they did feel they had to do much more and really address this. I think perhaps the strongest example for a company taking action quite early on, and even before we published the report, was Boodles, a UK luxury jeweler. And they initially told us they were doing fine and it wasn't really necessary for them to change. And then about 6 months into this dialogue, they came back to us and said, we really do think we need to do something. And what they did is they had very, very soft and vague requirements for their suppliers. And they were also only for the diamond suppliers. And they really strengthened and made much more explicit the requirements that they had for their suppliers, and they made them public. So that was a positive step. And we've seen other companies do a little bit the same. So one of the fairly common responses from these 10 companies or 11 was that they said, okay, we will improve and strengthen our supplier code of conduct, or whatever that document was called. Requirements. We believe that's really important, but we also think that's not enough. So I've just said talked about what is necessary. And obviously there needs to be really rigorous checking, because otherwise, they will just go along with whatever the suppliers tell them. And ultimately, as I mentioned, many companies still do not know where the gold ultimately originates from. So unless they know that, it's not enough. So, we are very happy that several companies, I mentioned Boodles, but also I can mention a couple of other ones there. For example, Bulgari in Italy, Pandora in Denmark, Christ in Germany, Signet to some extent in the US, a very big jeweler that owns several high street shops, Kay, for example, and Zales. They did definitely take some good steps in the right direction, but I would also say from our perspective, there's still a lot of need for better action and more action for true responsible sourcing. We don't see that yet.
Thank you. Sarah, there's a question that has come in about the Peruvian government. What is the Peruvian government doing about the situation in Madre de Dios? You've been down, to the Amazon numerous times. You obviously grew a great deal. What is the current government doing, and past government? Was there any interest, in tackling this issue of the gold mine?
Well, thanks for the question. I've been going down to the Amazon since 1999, and at that point, we were working in the largest contiguous piece of rainforest left on the planet. And in 2001, when the prices of gold shot up, miners started to come, as many as 70,000 started to come in to mine for gold. So I've been working in the gold space now since around 2009. And there's been lots of changes in government since then. It's been really interesting because it's such an out of control issue, and it's incredibly complex, as you can see by looking at the film. That you have the Peruvian government will come down, they'll do some bombing, the president comes in, they'll stop the bombing. But recently, within about the last 6 months, this new administration has decided that they were going to really try to tackle the situation. So they went in there, again, I think around 6 months ago with the Peruvian army, and they got a lot of the bad actors out of there. We don't know where a lot of them went. We're concerned that there's some leakage and that they go into other areas of the Amazon because it's so vast that it's actually hard to see where they are. So they're stationed there now, the Peruvian army. Things have supposedly calmed down quite a bit. And what's kind of interesting, about what they're doing now is they're actually bringing in the economics to actually look at how to formalize the sector and to bring infrastructure to the sector, regulate it so they're all working in a mining zone, bringing in better technologies, etc. So that's all sort of at the new stages, and my fingers are crossed that they'll continue and bringing in the better mining-free technologies. We're not going to boycott small-scale mining. That's just, I don't see that happening. It's more about making sure that they're working in areas, contained areas where they can mine for the gold, mercury-free, and keep some of the migratory corridors that we need to have established. And for the indigenous people, we need to have areas that are kept intact. Because right now they're just working here and there, and they're chopping up the forests and the pathways for food, etc. So there is hope that that is happening. The UN is involved. The Global Environmental Facility is also engaged in bringing better technologies to Peru, and they have funding to be able to do that. So there's a lot of people working on it, and hopefully everyone will step out of their silos and work together. But the good news is the Peruvian government is in there. They're interested in actually having governance, and hopefully we can move the needle in a positive direction.
And I know that with the film, you have screened it in Geneva in partnership with the UN. And I know, there's real interest in screening it at the UN in New York. Do you know if anybody in the Peruvian government has yet seen the film?
They have in the past. The U.S. government actually in Peru at the U.S. Embassy, they were really engaged with us there for a while. And I think we are starting to get the film out in Peru, but not to the highest levels. But I could see that maybe happening in the future, especially now that the Amazonia countries are starting to come together to look at the Amazon as a system. And hopefully we've got a lot of interest from the Peruvians to screen the film there as well. And as well as in Colombia, which is really great. A lot of the jewelers in Colombia are actually really interested in screening River of Gold.
And Daniel, on this topic of government involvement and with the indigenous tribes, we know that they're taking their fight, and they have taken their fight to the steps of government. And I'd like to hear your opinion and what survivalists do on the issue with President Jair Bolsonaro in Brazil and what's happening there and the threats to the indigenous peoples. And, they are really brave in taking their fight, right? Because he is someone who, has pulled back, laws that, were protecting the Amazon. So I'd like it because now everyone's talking about the Amazon and everyone wants engagement in what's happening with fires. Could you talk about the fight of the indigenous people in Brazil?
Yeah, so Bolsonaro in Brazil has really, in some ways, turned the clock back 50 years in terms of indigenous rights and trying to push for more opening up of their territories in the Amazon. It's a really scary and critical moment. But I mean, one good piece of news in Brazil is, basically as though he's declared war on their rights this year. They've really come together in the face of this existential threat and have presented a really united front against the government's aggression. And they've even been able to, I think, overcome a lot of, longstanding divisions between different communities, organizations, given the threat of Bolsonaro. And just a few examples: in January, they led the biggest ever, we think, global protest for indigenous rights. This was huge right after he took office. In April, there was another really large meeting. They took their message right to Brasilia, the heart of the government in Brazil, and just recently again for Amazon Day. And, some good news is these have been proven to be, to have some impact. Some of Bolsonaro's executive actions that he pushed through early in his administration, stripping the Indian Affairs Ministry of their responsibility or their authority to demarcate indigenous land. He wanted to move that to the agricultural ministry, which is dominated by agribusiness interests, which of course very interested in the opposite, which is opening up more land for agribusiness, cattle ranching, etc. And we believe because of this really strong front that the indigenous people put forward, also with allies like Survival and others in the United States and Europe, the Congress reversed it. So, I mean, it's not, you know, a done victory, and so there's other other ways that Bolsonaro is continuing to try to undermine indigenous rights, and basically, because he sees the Amazon as this treasure trove of resources. He believes that groups like ours and Amazon Aid and others, you know, are really restricting Brazil's development by our concern for the Amazon and living there. So the situation is still quite dire, but I mean, I really believe that in this dark storm, this kind of fast-moving and sometimes slow-moving disaster that Bolsonaro represents, that there are some quite positive developments. And I would just like to punctuate, this is really, really critical. 80% of the world's remaining biodiversity are in indigenous areas. And if you look at satellite photos over time, you'll see deforestation creeping in and spreading, and you'll see these islands of green, and you go, oh, what are these areas? And those areas are the indigenous territories where they've been given control over that. So we think they're the best barrier to deforestation. So it's very key attention, right, to ensure land rights. And I'll mention some of the areas that aren't burning in the Amazon are also some of these areas you see much less incidents of forest fires, which, you know, given the fires in the Amazon, although they aren't impacting large swaths of area, including indigenous areas, at least in indigenous areas, you are seeing less fires over time. So again, a lot of, I think, both dire developments, but also some good responses. And you know, pressure on. We need to keep, you know, highlighting what's going on, raising up voices from the grassroots and indigenous movements in Brazil.
Has there been that kind of outcry against Bolsonaro's government and what he's doing in the Amazon and in support for indigenous peoples?
I'm sorry, was that for me? I missed the first part of the question, Bonnie.
Yeah, no, the Brazilian public, have they come out, you know, in support of these marches of the indigenous peoples, you know, and come out and denounced Bolsonaro's initiatives?
Many have indeed. And, you know, Bolsonaro's, you know, approval rating, negative perception among the Brazilian public is rising. So the negative opinion is rising and the approval rating is going down, which I believe is a good sign. And it's not just about the Amazon indigenous rights, but he's, you know, very homophobic, you know, in general, trying to undermine the social safety net within Brazil, undercut labor rights. So there's a whole gamut of issues that the Brazilian public is pushing back again, and we can only hope that you know, continues.
Thank you. Juliane, one more question, and then I know we're coming up on our time, and I want to give you all the opportunity to issue some calls to action for those that are watching this webinar. Now, Human Rights Watch just issued a report on Amazon deforestation being driven by criminal networks. Can you just tell us a little bit, just a summary of the findings of this report, which people can then go to your website and read?
Yeah, so we published a report just this week, Tuesday, actually, that documents how deforestation in the Brazilian Amazon and also the fires there are largely driven by criminal networks. And these criminal illegal networks have also sometimes been involved in gold mining. In particularly, we investigated the violence that intimidation that a lot of these criminal networks use against people, including indigenous peoples, who try to stop them or denounce them. And we investigated 28 cases of murder, where people, most of them belonging to indigenous groups, have been murdered because they denounced illegal logging. And we found in our analysis that those responsible for this violence are rarely brought to justice. There's a larger number of killings that has sort of happened in this sort of space over the last decade or so. In general, that's really a pattern, this impunity. And of these just 28 killings that we looked at, only 2 went to trial. It's also really important to say that in many cases, these killings were preceded by death threats or other kinds of threats. And there was no action or not enough action. And had better action been taken, people could actually have been saved. So there was a real sort of lack of proper police response and police investigation. And this really brought us to this conclusion, I guess very much in line with what Daniel also just said, that effectively President Bolsonaro has unfortunately given the green light to these criminal networks involved in illegal logging and is undercutting Brazil's commitments to obviously reduce greenhouse gas emissions in line with the Paris Agreement.
Thank you. So as we wrap up, I just want to give our 3 panelists again just the opportunity for calls to action for the global public that is watching this webinar. So Sarah, why don't we start with you? Then we'll go to Juliane.
Thank you. I think Amazon Aid's goal is for everyone to be aware and share and be educated as best as you can, and look at great organizations like Human Rights Watch and Survival International, who are also have lots of information of how people can engage. We will be sending out early next week an email to everyone that's gotten the film and hopefully are on this webinar now, some action items of what people can actually do for follow-up. And we'll be including some of these great ideas that Survival International and Human Rights Watch has as well. So again, just be aware, we have lots of curriculum and the film. Get in touch with us, because the power of the film to create change is what we are really interested in engaging in, and being able to partner with great groups like you guys. So everyone be aware and share.
Thank you. Juliane?
Yes, it's great to be on this panel. Thank you for inviting us to be on this panel as well. And I think it's a good indication how important it is for different civil society actors to work together. And indeed, I think today is a special day to think about that, as we have seen the climate marches in more than 150 countries around the world, not just the US or Britain or Germany, but also Uganda and the Philippines and Kenya and many other parts of the world. So this is really, really important, and there is a real grassroots movement pushing for change. What is needed is, with regards to company responsibility, it is needed that companies are ultimately much stronger regulated by governments and controlled. From our perspective, what is needed is mandatory human rights due diligence. So companies are obliged then to follow these human rights safeguards. And it's not just a question of voluntary action or wanting to do it or not wanting to do it. That, from our perspective, is very important. Until that time, companies themselves have to take it upon themselves to really conduct this human rights due diligence in line with standards that are already out there. That means knowing where their gold is coming from, assessing that supply chain for human rights risks, and being transparent about their actions and telling the consumers and the public and affected populations about what they're actually doing. And then lastly, the consumer themselves, we also have our own power. When we go and buy a piece of jewelry, let's ask the jeweler, where is this piece of gold coming from? What have you done to find out what the human rights conditions are at the mines of origin, and who are your suppliers? Those kinds of questions from anybody really will already help change things. Thanks.
Thank you. And Daniel?
Yeah, I would also like to say thank you. And I really do believe that we're all stronger together this issue and all the related issues that we're facing. I really hope people will be interested in learning more and getting more involved on our website, which is www.survivalinternational.org. We have an activist pack with key materials for people there, different ideas about how they can get involved in different levels, depending where they are. There's also a petition there that you can sign and share by social media or other methods. And we also have, for people who are interested, a lot of background information and breaking updates on the Yanomami, other Amazonian indigenous peoples, their struggles to fight for their land. So again, thanks for the invite to be here, and thanks for being able to share with this really great panel and all the listeners.
Thank you. So now we have to wrap up this very informative and insightful conversation. I'd like to thank Sarah, Juliane, and Daniel for participating today and for your dedication and commitment to the life-saving work that you do every single day. And my deepest gratitude to all the viewers who saw the film and joined us for this discussion, and to everyone who is taking action today to protect our planet. Thank you. Goodbye.
Thank you.